Hello everyone and welcome to a new edition of Low-Code Café, episode 43. My name is Bogdan Litescu. I'm the founder and CEO of Planton. And for those of you that are new, this is a weekly webinar that we do for our community and for our team. We get together to explore technical issues, solutions that we find. We look at new features coming up, and also we have a big chunk of doing hands-on work, implementing something. This webinar is recorded, and the recordings are made available on our YouTube channels. So there is a lot of content there, and we do a very good job at bookmarking inside each video, so you don't have to watch 1 hour. You can browse and find the topics that are of interest. So I invite you to view past editions and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. And today we'll have an episode with Dale, our head of support. He will give us some lessons learned in the trenches in the support channel. And then we'll have some overview about what's coming, new features coming into the product. And finally, we'll have a new face today in the webinar presenting. It's Manu. He's a QA engineer in our team. And him and Reza did a wonderful job at building a security solution. We started this last week, and this week will be a lot about how to operate with the device fingerprinting in Planton. There are multiple ways to interact with us, so use any means available to you to ask questions and to share opinions. And also there is a feedback form that helps us improve with every edition. So without lingering any longer, I invite Dale, our head of support, to take over and give us some insights from what's happening on our support channel. What's new, what's interesting, what interesting solutions are we finding for our customers? Dale, you are on mute. I don't know if you already started presenting.
Start video, unmute. That's, I should have a sticker. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. I have a few things that I wanted to mention today. We had I just wanted to put a reminder of the value of the community forum. We've had a number of questions that were answered on the community forum, some by the community, some by the community and our team. There were 3 different ones that I picked out where people, there was a question about the value from one drop list as a SQL query parameter for a second drop list. That's something that that we do. It's a very easy feature in our forms product, and it was answered by the community. Somebody else wanted to hide a form and display a message instead of the form if the form had already been filled out. So it was kind of an already submitted message instead of showing the form. Again, we got that person got a very quick answer by the community, and someone else wanted to know about how to hide and show columns in a particular grid situation with a grid or listing, and got a very quick answer from the community. So and you know, I had part of the answer. The community member had another part of the answer, but people are getting their question answered. So one, I would say, embrace the community forum. If you haven't used it, embrace it. I want to also say thank you for the participation that we get from the community. And finally, I had a case that's not listed here today from a client who was kind of resisting using the community forum, wanted to interact by, it was all by email, and due to a number of problems with the emails going to spam and whatever, it took a long time to solve. And had they just used the community forum, it turns out that they probably would have gotten a very good answer very quickly, and So again, it's a great resource, and I encourage you to use it. Beyond that, I wanted to mention, I'm going to chat a little bit about the device fingerprint. This is a feature that Reza used last week in Remember Me. And I just wanted to explore it a little bit just to help visualize what it is. So I'm going to start by putting a form on the page, and we'll manage that. And I'm just going to start with a blank form. This is, the idea here is that let's just see what this device fingerprint is and what it does, and how it acts. And I think you'll find it help illuminate what Reza is going to talk more about today. So we'll add a field, and we'll look for the device fingerprint type. And I'm not really going to configure it. It's just going to be called device fingerprint. And it has all these options. And Reza talked briefly last week about what you can exclude. And this helps if you're trying to make the fingerprint more stable. There's certain things that you can remove, but we're just going to take all of these. And so if we save this and go back and take a look at the page, you'll find that the form is there, but it's not really showing us anything at all yet, because the fingerprint is a hidden feature by default or by design. So I'm going to go in and add a couple more things so that you can see this, see what it looks like. So I'm going to add a static text that I'm just going to leave called static text. And so we have a device fingerprint and static text. And I am also going to add a button. Let's see, yeah, we'll do a button that will display this. So we'll call it display. And we'll add an action that's just going to be a context action that inject data. And we'll say that we want to make the value of static text equal to the device fingerprint. And there's one more thing we have to do here. We have to do Ajax and update form Ajax. That'll keep it the form from completely refreshing when we refresh, when we save the field. So with that little bit of code, what we get is we now refresh, and we have a button, display fingerprint. And the fingerprint that gets generated, I just thought it would help to visualize. This is I don't know how long key, didn't count it out. It looks like 20, 24 characters, something like that. But it's a unique fingerprint. And if we were to go to, if we were to duplicate this page and just go to display it, notice that, and I just usually look at the last few characters, so 40, B, and then in 279, and we look on our other tab, it's the same thing. So the fingerprint, it generates one, and it's the same on the same browser. If we copy this and do an incognito session, use the same browser on the same page and display it, you'll see that we get the same fingerprint. So it generates a code that can be used regardless of whether you're in a single session, or if you switch over to incognito, the fingerprint of the device still identifies you. And so that's going to allow the Remember Me feature that Reza is going to talk about to work. So that's just kind of a quick, how does that work? I will also, let's get rid of that screen. If we look in, if we go to this form and change some of the characteristics, if we include less things, for example, if we exclude certain things from the design of the fingerprint will change, and let's say, so we have one that ends in 279, we'll refresh this page and display it again. and it gets a completely different value. So depending on what options you have, or if you change the options, you're going to change the design of the fingerprint, but then it'll be stable again between like an incognito or a regular session. So that's just kind of a peek at what you get out of a device fingerprint. I also would just quickly mention that I had reason to load up, and I mentioned in the last few sessions, we're working at handling our support email inbox, and so I kind of came up with a solution that processes out email and allows you to build rules to figure out how to classify emails. And so if anybody is facing that problem, I'd be happy to share. And with that, I'll just mention we're beginning discussions about a new feature. It might be low-code campfire, but just an opportunity to come and share around a Zoom meeting, a campfire Zoom meeting, how some of the things that you're working on, I'm working on, that maybe we can start sharing techniques and helping one another. So look for that in the weeks to come. We'll talk about that more. But that is from the trenches today. And with that, I am going to invite Reza to jump in and provide our main topic for today. The continuation of Remember Me. Now that I've remembered you, what do I do with you?
Exactly. Thanks, Dale. Yeah, so last week we had, I kind of realized there's a lot to this one and there was a lot to unpack. And so this week I kind of am taking the approach, we're going to do this across 2 more sessions, today and then next week. So last week we really kind of got through and focused on remembering the user, right? We were setting some cookies on their machine. We were encrypting those cookies so that they couldn't be fiddled with and it was secure. And we were storing in a table that we had created also as kind of a check and balance all the different places that they've chosen to be remembered from. And that gave us the ability to forget them if they wanted to clear that out. So and then we would log them in. And we kind of ran out of time. So this week, I just want to focus on, you've signaled you want to be remembered. I remember you, and I'm going to just take the happy path and all is well, and I'm going to log you in. We'll see where I've set the stage for next week, where you've signaled that you want to be remembered. I remember you, but something is off. Maybe your fingerprint has changed because your device has changed, or any other number of things that I want to look at. That's an IP I've never seen before. Anything I want to do there, and I can take it up a notch and challenge them with a second factor, whether it be a code that we send or using an authenticator application. And I think we're going to take up the Google authenticator application, and they'll be able to either provide a code or sign in to their mobile device. And if that's successful, we'll go ahead and continue the auto log on and probably update some things so we don't challenge them again next time. But that'll be next week. We're going to keep things, there's plenty to see here, and we can dive in a little deeper on the actions that went into it. And so kind of, so that was the overall, which we looked at last week, and the specifics around remembering. So this week, just kind of setting the stage. We want to automatically log in a user on a known device. We want to do it securely. We want to keep our history of where the user is signed in from. And we want to degrade gracefully, meaning if something goes awry or we need to challenge them, anything like that, we're not just going to error out, but we still allow them to proceed and log in as they normally would with their username and password. And like I said, we'll be setting the stage for this 2-factor authentication and some notifications and things like that, and showing them that history and making use of it next time. The key features we're going to look at that we use to make the auto login happen securely. We're going to look at how to retrieve cookies that are off the machine. We're going to look at RSA encryption and decryption and how those actions work. How we'll leverage the device fingerprint as part of this. generating an auto logon URL so that we're not having to go and mess with trying to figure out or retrieve their password out of the database. We're not going to know their password at all. We don't need to. There's an action for that. And just kind of some of the handy patterns and best practices of putting this stuff together rather than just chaining a bunch of actions together. And so I've got a couple things here. Let me reshare my screen so that I'm sharing the whole screen. Because just a quick refresher, here I have a Microsoft Edge browser. I'm going to sign out. I'm on the home page. And when I click to go to the login page, you'll see it flash for a second, and I'm signed in as some user. If I look at my profile and preferences, done a little bit of a update here. We've got our forget me on this device, forget me everywhere buttons, but I've also went ahead and incorporated our entity that we created that stores so the user can see, here's the places where you are remembered. And if you remember from last week, it's not enough just to have an entry in here, but we're leveraging a field in the entity called isActive. And that's kind of part of how we go ahead and forget them, is when we set it to false. And so I'm showing this now because as we go to make use of this entity as logging them in, one of the things we're looking for is not just a match of the fingerprint, but also that it's active. And by having this expiration date and some of this other good data here, we could run a scheduled job that runs every evening or something, a workflow that will go ahead and look for the expired ones and set the actives to false. And that then, regardless of the cookie, will not just let us go in. So what we can do is see that maybe, you know, they've signaled they want to be remembered for 30 days. That 30 days has passed. I don't need to completely make them log in again. I could use, that's another call out for next week where we want to go ahead and challenge them and refresh this expiration date, right? They've shown me that they really are them. I can trust them again, and I'll give them that window again without making them sign in from scratch and set the remember me from scratch. And you can see that last week I had done some forget me's. And so Chrome 89 is what comes up for Edge because it's using the Chromium browser. You'll see that I have a Firefox entry here, but it's set to false. And that's when I did a forget me last time. And so if I run over here, this is Firefox, and I go to log in, you'll see that I am prompted to log in. And I'll go ahead and log in real quick. Now, I'm going to do this twice. First time here, because this is what we're going to be looking at today, I'm not going to do remember me. So I'm just in, I'm logged in as some user. And if I go here and I look at my profile, you'll notice I only have the 2 active entries, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and sign out. I'm going to sign back in. This time I'll have it remember me. And now when I look at my profile, there's an entry here for Firefox, and it's active as true. And you can see it was created just now, and it expires basically a month from now. And so let's take a look over here where I'm signed in. So first of all, the magic for logging them in is going to happen from the login form. Okay, and that's where we had modified, and when they actually pushed the login button last week, we looked at where we were setting that we log them in, but first we go ahead and set the cookies up and we put their entry in like we just saw. But this time it's not when I hit the login button that I'm automatically being logged in. It's down here when the page first loads, okay, and particularly when things have initialized. And so all I really did here was add 3 things in. The first one is to go ahead and from the cookie that's on the machine, and we can take a look over here. And if I use my inspector like we were last week, we'll see that under application, let me zoom in a little bit, I have some cookies. Let me sort. And there's 3 of them. 2 of them are stored encrypted, but 1 of them is not. And it's just basically saying, hey, remember me, that feature, it's enabled on this device. and it's set to true. And so all I'm doing is grabbing that, and I'm, the way this is executing a token. So it's the tokens that are available to you over here, and it's one of the core tokens that we're using. And so you can execute a token anywhere in workflows, and you'll see that I make heavy use of this, and in your forms. And so I have this handy one that's called cookie. And when I say cookie colon, and then whatever the name of the entry for the cookie is. So in this case, it's called Remember Me. And what that's going to do back is get that value is true, okay? And I'm just setting that into an output token name. So I'm giving myself a token that will last in this context, just of this stack here. And it's called Remember Me value. And so the next action, and I always like to put the description here because it makes it easy to kind of follow and know where you're targeting and things. And so the next action is saying, hey, if the Remember Me value is true, if it's actually set from that cookie, I've got some decisions to make. The first one, and this is really where most of the heavy lifting, and I'm going to just read these out, and then we'll go actually trace them down in and see what's happening. But the flow really is, I have a workflow that if I've said that I want to remember them, I'm going to grab some things from the cookies, the fingerprint, the user, those encrypted values, and I'm going to pass them off to this workflow. And this workflow is going to figure out what needs to happen. So I have one workflow here. Even though this cookie I got real time, I didn't use a workflow for it. I just grabbed it right off the bat. I could have used a workflow, but again, there's a lot of different ways to use these things. It was a little bit cleaner and easier for me just to put this one action here that gets this. Now that I know that that's the case and it's true, I want to go ahead and the rest of the cookies, I have a workflow that's getting them. So we'll take a look at that workflow, and it's basically getting the fingerprint and the what user it is. That's the other two things that were stored. And it returns back to me the Remember Me users and the cookie fingerprint. And then I have a next workflow here that I run. It basically generates the login action. It figures out what should I do with this person. And there's really three options that it can return back to me. Two actually, but three things that can possibly happen. And so I check for those first. The first one is the workflow is going to tell me, hey, everything's good, auto log them in. And we'll see how we handle that. The next one is if it determined that a challenge was needed, the two-factor, which is what we'll tackle next week, I can handle that here. For now, I'm just displaying a message that if I did trigger this challenge, it was just a placeholder for me to say, hey, coming soon, you're going to get challenged, whatever, but I have a nice spot to plug in and replace this with whatever I want the challenge logic to be. But I was able to test, and this is just kind of something they call stubbing or mocking out an interface. And so people do this with APIs all the time. And in the coding programming world, you do the same thing in the low-code world, is you can stub things out so you can test and make sure everything's going to work. Now, if that workflow that always should return to me either that it was an auto login or a challenge, if that workflow didn't work and it did not give me one of those two results, then I have a fail-safe here that will just display a toast message and stop execution. So it's going to pop a little thing up, and it's going to basically show them a message that says something went wrong with auto login. Please log in using your credentials. Because remember, all we're doing here is initializing this form. This form is just getting, it's right when it's going to build itself out. So I'm either going to interrupt the process of building this form out by logging them in automatically, or challenging them, which when I logged in, you saw this briefly showed for a second. You never did see the form, and suddenly I'm in the application and I'm logged in. Now, if those actions didn't happen, then I would land here as the catch-all, and it just shows, it doesn't make a big deal of it. It just shows a little alert that says something went wrong, and it's sitting there ready for them to go ahead and sign in as they normally would without any kind of auto login. And I've got some good tracing and auditing and logging going on where I can be recording what's going on. So if I'm maybe the administrator of the site and they're going, hey, auto login's not working, I can go check my breadcrumbs and see what happened. And so how these work here is just checking the conditionally checking the login action that comes back from that workflow. And if it's auto login, I'm doing a redirect to URL action, and I'm just sending them to the auto login URL that's provided back to me. If it's challenge, then right now I'm showing the message box. But what I could do is pass them to a workflow, a different interface, something that's going to challenge them to give me some information. And so we'll take a look at that in more detail next week. But let's go ahead and back it up now. So we've just kind of seen the overall high-level flow. As I get the cookies, I pass it to one main workflow that figures out what I'm supposed to do, and then I take the appropriate action. And so let's take a look at what that workflow is. And it's called Initialize Remember Me. And so it takes in the fingerprints, the current fingerprint, the cookie fingerprint. So I go ahead and I fingerprint fresh, just like Dale was showing, and I store that in a hidden text box. And so I know what's your fingerprint right now, but in the cookie, it was your fingerprint when you said remember me. And I want to compare those in a second here. So I send those into this workflow. I want to know who the user is because I don't know yet. Other than the cookie, I don't really know who this person is because they haven't signed in yet. And a lot of times when you land on this login page, it has a feature built in where if someone's session had timed out or you're giving them a link to a certain page on the site, maybe you've emailed them something, but you need them to sign in first, that page will redirect them. Any page can redirect them to a return URL. And you can see that here. And so all I'm doing is if that was there and the user needs to be redirected to a different landing page, not the main home page, I want to pass that into this workflow that figures out what it's supposed to do. So I just get that from the query string so that when I generate my auto login link, I may not be taking them to the home screen, but I may be taking them to somewhere where they were intending to do work or they had timed out or something like that. So let's take a look at this workflow, and it's called Initialize Remember Me. So it takes in a fingerprint for a user, and if valid, if a valid Remember Me record exists for the device, it gives back an auto login URL. It's kind of the happy path we're going down today. And so you can see these are the inputs. The current fingerprint, because I'm not forcing or we're not doing the challenge part yet, I didn't make it required yet. I don't want that in my way. But what I do need is the cookie fingerprint and the Remember Me user from the cookie. It's a no-go if I don't have those, and we'll see why. So I don't want to go down my workflow path and then have it blow up or error out, because it will if these don't exist. And so I make sure that those are required. The workflow would return a response to me that says, hey, required fields missing, whatever, and I can handle those in my form. I would probably get that error message triggered because it would never return a login action. And then this return URL is totally optional. If I give it, it'll use it. If I don't, it won't. And so zoom in a little bit and let's look at the steps. And it's really, it looks like a lot of actions, but it's pretty straightforward. And part of the patterns that I talk about that we're using here is a couple of things. One, first action. I've got another workflow that I'm executing called RSA Decrypt. And this is what I wanted to show, and I'm going to have Manu kind of assist me here a little bit, is there are actions. So let's go ahead and open another one of these up, because I don't want to leave here. I'm working here, but I want to take a look at these other workflows, how they work, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to duplicate this tab. I'm going to go back to workflows, and you'll notice I have an RSA Encrypt and a Decrypt. Let's go ahead and, even though Decrypt is what we're calling on this one, let's take a quick look at the encryption one, right? Because you can only decrypt something that's been encrypted first. And why don't I just demo it real quick? So I put this in a workflow, and you're going to take a look and go, wow, a workflow that just has one action, why? Well, one, it has some secure settings, it has some setup to it, and if my keys and things that we'll look at change, I don't want to go all over the place and change them. One. Two, it takes a little more knowledge and thought to set up that action than it does just to call a workflow that all I have to do is pass in a value. And what it returns to me back is an encrypted value. And so I'm going to just copy this encrypted value. And if I now go to this decrypt workflow, it's just the counterpart, it takes an encrypted value and returns back a decrypted value. So you can see that it's working. And that was another thing that putting it in a workflow gives me, is the ability to build in little components, little microservice type things. And they just little functions that do a thing. And so now in order for me to test or know that things are working, and as I was wiring all of this up, and there was a time when at first it wasn't working, and what we found was that the value that was encrypted, if we go back and look at our cookie here, so I can take, for example, this value right here out of the cookie, and we were going, why is this not working? Well, I was able to say, hey, let's check this out. I'm going to put it into the decrypted, and you can see, it's my email, right? Now, at the time, it was saying brackets and like username. And I was like, aha, we didn't pass the right, we weren't encrypting the right thing. It didn't get tokenized. So it helps with troubleshooting, and it makes for ease of use. Let's go ahead and just look at encrypt first, because these go together. And you'll see that all I have for this whole workflow, this is one of those great little utility workflows that you can export and import to different applications. Very reusable and easy to make use of. I take in something, a parameter just called raw value. It's large text. It's required because things aren't going to work on this action if I don't actually give it something. And then there's this action here called RSA Encrypt. And what this thing does, and then we have two flavors of this. We have AES encryption and we have RSA encryption. What's the difference, when to use? I kind of touched on this last week. You can kind of Google and read up on these, but the RSA encryption is a little bit more modern and a higher level of encryption. So I would recommend using this one. They work almost exactly the same way. You have a public key and you have a private key. And the public key you can give out to everyone, right? It's like two keys needed to lock something, right? This key lets you lock, and then the private key lets you unlock. And so I, the developer, the owner of this application, I keep the private key for me only private. But if I did need or want to expose or make this available to someone, I can give them the public key so that not just anyone can use my encryption. And this also kind of gives the cipher to scramble things up with. And this key looks really complex and all this stuff, but we have a handy thing built in here to generate public and private key. And so I'll just open this in a new tab. And what this does is you can say how big or complex of a key do you want, minimum and maximum. We'll just do a simple one here. And when I hit generate, it creates for me both the public key, what goes in the public key action for encryption, and then what goes in the decryption is the private key. And it gives me both of these. You'll want to keep these safe because every time you run this, you're going to get something new, right? It's never the same. So you're going to want to keep this safe. And for the purposes of this demo, let me get this out of my way. I went ahead and I put this in here, but you'll notice that it supports my tokens. And if I momentarily run over, and there was a couple places, I just wanted to keep things simple for us today, but I have like these helper tokens, and you'll notice that I made a token here for the public key. And when I run this, it is storing that for me. And so if I wanted, I could just put this in there. And that's all that needs to be there. And why would you do that? Well, it keeps things, again, cleaner to look at, simpler. And I think more important is maybe you don't want this exposed to anyone who's working in a workflow, right? And you might say, well, but now it's exposed in the token, right? And so it's a little easier to change in a token. And you're right. One of the things I kind of saw as I started going down the rabbit hole a little bit is that it's kind of tricky to have some very secure things, and there's different levels or places you can hide them. One of the other tokens that we have is here in tokens. There's one called app settings. And this will read from your web.config. And so you can put this in the web config and then use a token that gets it from the key of your web config. And so now only people that can access the web config can get at it. but it's sitting in there and it's plain text. And so one of the great things that came out of this exercise and us doing this together as a team for this Low-Code Cafe was we realized what we were missing, and what we want to do is we want to come over here in connectors, and we want to give you all a new connector type that is user defined. And this is kind of a secure vault where you can put things in and you can get things out, but you can't see what they are. You can just use them as tokens and as actions and things. So like working with the GitHub and the different connectors we have to third-party stuff, we want to make it so that you can define in-app your own connectors, or maybe you're making your own custom connector through an API, and you want to, you almost always need these bearer tokens and these keys and these different types of things. And we're going to give you somewhere good and safe to store those. But we'll call that beyond the reach of this demo and this exercise for now. Like I said, you can always put it in the web config and fetch it out of there via a token and put the token here. And now only your most highest privileged users are going to be able to access that, which is not 99% of your users. And you've got a nifty workflow here that lets you encrypt. And if we run back over here to our RSA Decrypt, you'll see that it works in very much the same way. There's just an action called RSA Decrypt, and it takes in that private key, okay? And it takes in, the other thing that both of these do is it says, great, now tell me what fields you want to mess with, and I'll return them to you as basically tokens that you can use. So I had an input parameter called encrypted data in this case. So I put my brackets around it, which then renders it as the actual what I passed into the workflow. And it's going to give me a token or more, if I wanted more, back out, which is the decrypted value. And then that's all this thing returns back. And I can just reuse the same naming. I'm saying, hey, the workflow itself is going to return something called decrypted value, and it is going to be whatever was decrypted. So a couple of handy little things there. We'll get this guy set up to look at our next kind of workflow we're using, because this is kind of a master workflow, right? It's one that orchestrates a lot of different things. So first thing I do is I decrypt the username that was in the cookie. And why do I do that there? Because my next action is to query for the user info. And you'll see here that, remember, the user entity or table that's available to us is kind of a special one, right? It's one that is part of the core platform. It's not one of the ones that you've created. And so you really can't edit or control access to it. And so you really have a couple of options. You could do a read action. But Manu, do you remember why we did not use a read action in the case of, and why we went with the query here?
I think initially we had some trouble because we tried to use email, and filtering by that value, we were getting errors.
That's right. So
because the Petapoco that was introduced in the newer versions.
Exactly. So you'll see these read actions are super handy, except they don't have a where clause. They assume that you have the ID of a record that you're looking up, and that's what you're passing in. Well, a user ID is numerical in the system. And in this case, what I'm storing in the cookie is the email address, which is the username in this application, right? And so we went ahead and just ran a simple SQL query and just grabbing the user ID and the username and the email, why not? And where username is the decrypted username. So I ran the workflow for RSA Decrypt, and I stored the output, the return of that workflow, as something called DEC for Decrypted Remember Me User. So now I can fetch the user, and I'm going to store the result of this query, this one record that's coming back to me, in something I just called RM user, Remember Me User, right? So now I have decrypted what was stored on their device. I've now found a user record. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and decrypt that fingerprint. So now, instead of using the decrypt action, setting up all those public keys and all that kind of stuff, I'm just running my handy workflow again. I'm giving the cookie fingerprint that came into the workflow off of their cookie. And I'm returning it as just cookie fingerprint again, decrypting it. So now, for the kind of same reasons as before, even though they're, in this case, it's a little bit different. I'm going to my entity, and it's the entity that houses these fingerprints. Now I'm kind of the developer administrator. So when I was just the regular standard user, I was only seeing my entries, right? But here you can see, I can see everyone and everything they've done. Well, I'm coming to this table, this entity, and I'm saying, I need to go grab the record that matches their fingerprint, right? Because I want to do some checks, and I want to make sure that, apologies, too many little tabs here. I want to, I've got a little extra where clause. So for the same reason as why I don't have an ID necessarily yet to go and target one record, what I need is a where clause. And so reason we split this up was just to show you, you can write SQL if you're comfortable with SQL and have that flexibility. But we also have the read all action of any entity, and where you do get to put a where clause in. And so in this case, I'm saying target that entity, that table, and I'm saying there's a field in there, that's the device fingerprint that we've stored. I want it to match the decrypted cookie fingerprint. And the user ID, now I'm using my RM user, where I had SQL queried to say, look up this user, and I go ahead and I'm doing it by the numerical ID. Because just in case someone else has the same username, or maybe their username has changed, or for some reason over time. So I want to make sure I target the user in the rightest possible way, and I feel like ID was a better case for that. And then very important on the end here is and is active equals true. So I'm not just saying, do I have a fingerprint for this user? Do I have an active fingerprint for this user, right? So the cookie is great. It's encrypted. It's telling me something, but I'm not trusting it blindly. I'm using it to go to my real source of truth, which I 100% control. It's not on the user's machine. No one can manipulate and play with it. Even those encrypted cookies, I could technically copy it and put it on another machine or something like that. What I can't do is fake these records out here. And so this will return, when you do a read all, multiple records. And so in this case, I'm saying just return one to me. So I know I'm dealing with just one record, and I'll show why in a second. And then give this a output, a name. Now, when you use the read all action, it returns back to you a set of JSON. It's a JSON payload that comes back out of this. So by itself, it's a bunch of JSON that I need to do something with. So I store this in login details, and you'll notice right here, it even tells you, you can reference the output of this token in subsequent actions, for example, load entities JSON, using the following syntax. Whatever your output token name was, so in this case, login details, :JSON. And in my next action, I'm basically using a load JSON. And in this case, it's the taking it one step farther, parsing JSON into tokens. So I always like to put, and keep in mind, whatever title you put here in these actions, so that you notice I comment so that it's easy for me to just kind of follow along the logic. But I also go ahead and I put this, I edit the description of these actions so that I know specifically what I'm doing. So these are kind of high level guidance about following the flow. But if I need to dig a little deeper, I see, okay, tokenize all the login detail JSON. And I know I'm using a parse JSON in the tokens action for login details, right? And all this wants, this action is a JSON string. And that was what the prior action told us. If we wanted to get access to our JSON payload, that this was the syntax for that. And then it's gonna now give you tokens. You can access whatever was in that JSON as individual kind of properties as tokens. So I want to use those. So I went ahead and I'm just keeping things simple for myself. I just called the base token for this LD. So it's login details. So what am I doing with this? All I've done so far was kind of set the stage for the big magic moment, the split here, okay? That's the kind of point of this whole workflow, is to make sure that I've got a good user, and in this happy path, I'm supposed to just log them in. And if I am, go ahead and log them in. If I'm not, challenge them. If none of this worked out, make them log in by hand. So I took the 2 encrypted values that were in my cookie, the user, and I took the fingerprint, I decrypted them, and I fetched both the user record and my login detail record from that entity. That's just every time I remember someone, I write that in there, and I'm keeping track of, is this current or not? Are they active or not? Allowing to use this fingerprint, regardless of what the cookie says. If they don't match, it's a great chance for me to do some custom challenging, and that's really what the split here is. I'm just saying LD 0.id. So the record, 0 in kind of coding and programming, when you have a set of data, is always the first record, not 1. That always trips people up. If I'm doing a loop or anything, things always start at 0. That actually is the first one. And so even though I only have 1 record, the way that accessing this works, because when I'm parsing into tokens, maybe I had 3 records. I have the ability to target 0, 1, and 2 that way. Well, I know I only have 1. It is 0, the first record. And then any of the things that I've turned into, so when I read all the login details, everything that's in that entity, and if we just hop over here and we look at login details as an entity, this is the one that we're seeing there displayed in the user profile. So this is the rendition of it is here, the definition of it here, and it's where I'm storing things like their device fingerprint, I have their user ID, I have when they expire, are they active? So any of these fields that are defined in here are available to me now because I've parsed that JSON into tokens. They're available to me through this, and I've turned the tokens into something called LD. So in this case, I'm checking the ID, and then a handy trick, because what if I didn't have a match, right? So what I always do is whenever I'm going to have a critical moment where I'm saying I'm splitting based on some token, some parameter that's dynamic, I always default it to something in case it wasn't set, in case something went wrong, in case I didn't find a record. I always set it to something. In this case, I'm looking for a record ID of that table. And we know that when an ID is written in a table, it's always going to have an ID greater than 0, right? Starts at 1 usually and goes on up, right? So what I do is when I use this equal syntax inside the brackets of a token, it's me saying, look, anything to the left of the equals is what I'm really after. And if you have that value, that's what you're going to output to me when I process this token. If you didn't have anything, you don't know what I'm talking about there. Maybe I typoed here for some reason. If I called this LE, there is no LE right now with this 0.id, right? So it would just be an empty string. Instead of that, I'm saying do what's to the right. If the thing to the left doesn't have anything, you don't know what it is, return back the thing to the right, and all I'm doing is setting it to 0. So I'm saying, look, if it's greater than 0, that means I have an active login detail record for them in that table. It says is active, it's tied to this user that I looked up based on the cookie and that sort of thing. I'm going to go down the path of, we're good here. I've got someone, I know them, they're right, there's a record. Let's figure out what action to take. And that's another workflow we'll look at. But real quick, well, what's the alternative? Okay, I didn't find a record for you. That either means that I didn't find a user record for you, so I couldn't use your record, your user record to find the login detail record, right? These kind of fed into each other. But either way, this did not net me something for whatever reason. So again, my comment is just saying I didn't have a valid login detail record. So return error as the login action, right? And what I go ahead and I do here is I'm just having my workflow, the login action, which is really what this whole workflow results in, right? All I do is I give it the stuff that's in the cookies, and I say, go figure out what's supposed to happen. And all the figure out what's supposed to happen is really login action, as we saw in our form over here, right? All I'm doing is running this workflow. And then over here, I'm using this login action to determine what's the next step I take. So the login action is either going to return for me, apologies, where'd my workflow go? Oh, I think I'm in it here. Yeah, so the login action is going to return something for me. Either it's telling me to log them in or challenge them, but I wanted to have another value here so that this always results in something. And here I'm saying error, right? And no auto login URL. We'll take a look at auto login URL next. And we're almost kind of through this here. I kind of wanted to make sure I step through this one step by step, because this is the happy path to login. So if it didn't work, I go ahead also and I say, look, for whatever reason, this didn't work out. Let me call a different workflow that I have. And let's take a look at that one, because it's a quicker, simpler one. And it's just called clear cookies. Clears the Remember Me cookies from the current user's device. And so it's just doing an execute actions, which is basically saying chain together. I could have just strung these together along the workflow. I put them in one pop here. And there's another token. We saw cookie, and then I just used the name. Cookie Remember Me on the form was how I was getting the value of Remember Me. Well, that same core token that ships with the system, cookie, has a kind of a little sub action called remove. And when you use this, you just tell it, okay, what's the name of the cookie you want to remove? So in this case, I'm removing the Remember Me, I'm removing the Remember Me user, and I'm removing the Remember Me fingerprint. If these didn't exist, maybe I deleted, someone goofed with it or manipulated it, whatever happened, right? But for some reason, this didn't work out and I wasn't able to figure them out. Let me clear things out so that they can kind of be in a state to log in again and say, remember me, and start over clean, okay? So that's all this workflow is doing, and it just returns back a success. You have been forgotten. It's also the same thing I use over here when they say forget me on this device. So that's why I love the workflows, right? I detected on trying to auto log them in, something didn't go right. Let's clear the cookies out, which is effectively how we forget them. And if they push this button here to forget me on this device, I'm just calling that same workflow clear cookies. And I'm forgetting them on the device, and that's why it's returning this message. And that's what would pop this message up. You have been forgotten, right? It's just calling that workflow. So let's hop back and look at the kind of more interesting workflow here. And the last workflow is determine, execute, login action. And so determine login action takes in current and stored fingerprints for a given user and sets the login action. So one, it takes in I know user ID from my other workflow. I know their current fingerprint off the form. I know the cookie fingerprint. It's decrypted and stuff now. I handled all that in the other one. And this is a safe workflow. I'm in control of when these are called. So I don't need to mess with all the encryption, decryption stuff here. And lastly, I'm going to build out a return URL for them. So first thing I do is I just, I do a check here. And this, I'm using two actions. All this thing's really doing is making a determination of what's the login action, first of all. And that's what I'm going to split on. I have two inject datas. Either I'm doing an auto logon or I'm going to challenge. And the logic here is if the current fingerprint matches the stored fingerprint, right? Every time you hit this page, like Dale was showing in his, I get a clean, fresh new fingerprint that I have hidden on that form. I pass it into these workflows, but I also have retrieved the one off the cookies. All I'm doing here is I'm comparing those. And I'm saying when these two things match, we're good. I want to auto log you on. Everything's straight. I remember you. I know you. And I'm going to go ahead and log you on. When they don't match, this one will fire. Where current fingerprint and cookie fingerprint don't match, I just set login action to challenge. Now that I've set the stage, one of these two is always going to happen, okay? Because I've already handled my error case in the big workflow. So I knew that once I get here, the only thing left to decide is, am I auto logging you on or am I challenging you, right? Well, in the case of challenge, for now, this is for the future, and this is what we'll look at next week. For now, I'm just stopping execution of the workflow using this stop execution action, which causes the workflow to basically return whatever output it has. So I'd already set the login action to challenge, and I set the URL to nothing there. And I think I was just for my own kind of troubleshooting or whatever, if I wanted, I went ahead and said, hey, what's the result of that evaluation I did, right? This is one of the handy things about these workflows. I'm not using this, I can delete it. No one's ever gonna see it, but it is what determined which one of these two should have gotten run. Now, the last thing that brings it all together is if I know to auto log you in, we have this action called generate auto login link. And all it does is you give it a user ID and you tell them what page do you want them to redirect. It's going to build out a very magical, very special URL that when visited, whether it's manually or they're redirected to there, it is set to take an action of logging someone in. So you give it the user ID. Well, I figured all that out in the other workflow, and I've passed it into this one. And return URL, remember that was what I got out of the query string. And if it's nothing, I'm just going to take you to the home page. But if you had timed out from maybe your profile page or something, well, the way that the timeout and things work and taking you to the login page is it puts that return URL there. So I'm just kind of preserving that along so you can time out, I can auto log you in and land you right back where you were. And the key here is I only want this good one time, right? Every time they log out or not logged in and they go to log in this case, you could put a 0 here or empty and it would be unlimited. Too dangerous, too powerful. I don't want a URL that if someone just lands on it, they can unlimited amount of time get in there, right? So I just want this to be a one-time use thing and I'm making use of it right now. And it kind of sets a time period up for it. So it can expire if for some reason you're not using it for this use case where we're firing this all instantly. For example, you can email, and when you do a password reset in the system, this is the action that's happening that's sending you that new user creation or password reset that says, hey, click here to log in, right? And so you can send these to someone. Well, if you did, you might want to say, and I'm just letting this be valid for 5 minutes here from now, right? And if, probably could have done 1 minute or whatever, but it's all going to fire instantly. If for some reason something errored out, it didn't work, I don't want this good forever. And so I just said it goes away in 5 minutes. You can pick how long you want it to be good for. And at the end of the day, like a lot of these actions, they build stuff up. Our encrypt and decrypt did, the cookie stuff did. You always want to say the result of this is what, so I can work with it in the next thing. Well, it's going to be a token that's called Autologin URL. And that's all this thing returns. What's the action? What's the Autologin URL? This, don't worry about it. This was just me. I can kill it here. It was me when I was building and wanting to make sure my stuff worked. And you'll notice I default to a / on the return URL, just so I know always send them home if nothing was passed in. Now, going back to the form, you can see where we run, kind of taking it back up, we grab the cookie, we know they want to be remembered, we run that big workflow that's figuring out what to do with them, we give it the fingerprints and the user all encrypted at this point, and from the query string, what's the return URL? And the net result of that workflow that figured everything out we've looked at today is me being able to take a very simple action. In this case, if the action is auto login, then I'm going to auto log, I'm going to redirect them to a URL. Go to that page, that URL, which when visited automatically logs you in within that 5-minute window, one-time use. That's what that was built up in my payload here of auto login URL. And that's just where I'm taking them. Once I do that, that's when you're seeing the net result of this. I sign out, I hit login. You can see the page kind of starts out there. Oh, I deleted the cookie off here when we were playing, but that's the login. Otherwise, if that workflow returns challenge, I've set the stage, and this is what we'll look at next week. What do we do when the thing came back and said to challenge them? And so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to prompt them for additional information to confirm for me. I think I know who you are, but let's just double check and make sure. And then we'll log them in. So I think we hit it on the money today, and I'm hoping this one was really clear for everyone. I went deep.
Oh, very cool. And I love that you demonstrated the way to document a workflow. And I also saw you snuck in stop execution I think I suggested that feature. It came off of a need on the Help Center. So nice to see that all come together.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Manu. Manu really was the, I'm but a mere presenter here. I'm his mouthpiece. He did all this magic. So thank you, Manu.
Don't be too shy. You've done a lot.
Thank you. All right. Next week's the grand finale then.
Awesome. Looks like we have a plan for next week. So I'm looking forward to see how this finishes, like watching this season, the grand finale. So thanks everyone for being here. Thanks guys for putting the effort to to create this security guide. You know, my vision is that we'll get these implemented as features in the product, because I think then it will be really awesome. These are like modern things that you do want to have, and if we can make them available out of the box, even better. Cool. So thanks everyone for being here. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, please help us by giving feedback on the form that's posted in the chat window, and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. See you again next week.